Hi, everyone, and welcome to GLF Live. My name is Gabrielle Lipton, the editor-in-chief for the Global Landscapes Forum, and I will be your moderator today. This is a very special GLF Live because it's one of the first public sharings of a standard that's been 3 years in the making. It's also close to my heart as the Global Landscapes Forum has followed its development closely over the years, and we're so excited to finally see it launch, which will officially happen at our event alongside COP27 in less than a month's time, but we're here to discuss it a bit today. What I'm referring to here is the Land Rights Standard, which is a working title, but it's a standard for the rights of Indigenous peoples, looking at their land rights, their human rights, their cultural rights, their legal rights, and more, and how those should be incorporated into decision-making and policy and business frameworks. As I mentioned, it took more than 3 years to develop, and that's because more than 70 Indigenous, local, and Afro-descendant groups were consulted on its development and inclusions. So it is a really genuine standard through and through. The Rights and Resources Initiative and the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development, with support from the Forest Peoples Program, as well as us at the GLF, facilitated its creation. But the process was really led by the people that the standard will serve. So I don't want to take up too much time in this introduction, but I'll briefly quote one sentence that I think summarizes what the standard is about, and this is pulled from the standard itself. And that is building on the rights affirmed in international human rights instruments and the aspirations of Indigenous peoples, local communities, Afro-descendant peoples, and those of women and youth within these groups. The following standard was developed to ensure that all programs, projects, and initiatives in landscapes are undertaken in partnership and solidarity with the aforementioned rights holders, taking into account and respecting their distinct and differentiated rights, including their autonomy, priorities, and cosmovision. So that comes in the preamble of the standard and gives you a taste of what it is about. So I think the scene is set now, and I will introduce our wonderful speakers. We have with us Alain Frechette, Director of Strategic Analysis and Global Engagement at the Rights and Resources Initiative. And we have with us Gam Shimray, Secretary General of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, AIPP, and an Indigenous activist for more than 30 years. Both of these men have been crucial to the standard's creation, and we really appreciate them for doing so and for taking the time to share with us here today. So welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for all of your work on this standard and for telling us about it here. And so we are just going to go straight into the questions here, and I will start with you, Alain. You've been with the standard since its inception. Can you tell us a little bit about what specifically prompted its creation and how it got off the ground?
Well, thank you very much, Gabrielle, and thank you for that lovely introduction. It is now widely recognized that Indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant peoples are the best guardians of nature, and that to sustainably manage, use, and conserve the world's forests, landscapes, and natural resources, all actions and decisions must be pursued in a manner that actually recognizes and respects their land, territorial, and resource rights. As such, a wide range of social environmental frameworks, standards, and certification systems have been developed to support such ends, but efforts to date have largely been uncoordinated. Most are designed to do no harm and treating local peoples as a risk to be mitigated rather than key decision makers. And absent from these are a common set of globally recognized principles grounded in international human rights law and the aspirations of rights holders. This is what prompted the Indigenous Peoples Majors Group for Sustainable Development, the Rights and Resources Initiative, and other key partners such as the Forest Peoples Program and the Global Landscape Forum to come together in 2019 to both address these shortcomings and develop a framework that could trigger a race to the top rather than a leveling down to basic safeguards. So in essence, that's how and why the standard was created.
Thank you so much. And I think it's very poignant that you pointed out the absence of principles for these rights for so long. And that's the gap that this standard really seeks to serve. So Gam, you're part of an Indigenous group that was consulted in this process. When did you first learn about the standard, and how did you find it different from other initiatives you'd encountered before?
Yeah, thank you very much, Gabriel. My response also relates very much to what Ellen was saying. I think the major difference that we see in this standard is its groundedness in the international human rights standards. Also, it is also what captures the indigenous worldview and the way indigenous sees land. I think that is really important, meaning it's also in terms of the history, our connection with nature, our well-being, and so on. And that's really important, which we don't see in the other kinds of standards or safeguards around the world. And therefore, this was one critical aspect. But also, most importantly, politically speaking, is that often land and self-governance has been seen as two separate things, which is not the case in reality. These two are inseparable. So looking at this in a more holistic sense makes much more sense to indigenous peoples. That's also one of the main points. I just give you an example. For example, in India, way back in 1996, self-governance law was passed for the communities. But when this was passed, they were made the king, but they had no land. So they were made a king without a kingdom, you see. So that is the inseparable nature of these issues of land rights of indigenous peoples, which this standard captures. So I think politically, that's one of the most important vision that we're looking at. Yeah, thank you, Gabriel.
Yeah, that's absolutely a really good point. And it's nice to hear that the Indigenous perspective is really embedded in the standard itself, and really bringing in that active participation and that true voice to the standard, and seeing these issues from the eyes of the people that it seeks to serve. Ella, I'll go back to you. The standard took more than 3 years to come together. I suppose in part due to COVID, but could you tell us a bit more about that time and that process and what happened in the past 3 years?
Yes, rightly. COVID did play a major part in what happened. The standard was born out of the GLF year on rights, which was in 2019. It was intended to showcase the convening power and influence of the GLF on all landscape level actions and interventions. In effect, the idea was to create an instrument that could translate the key aspirations of rights holders from across the world into a set of credible action points that reflected the whole ambition of Indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant peoples, as well as women within these groups. Under IPMG's leadership, the team commissioned a review of international law and standards that was conducted by the Forest Peoples Program. An assembly of rights holder representatives from different parts of the world reviewed these and jointly agreed on a list of 10 essential principles that form the basis of the current standard. These were then widely shared with rights holders from across the world to collect their feedback and update the standards through an iterative process of engagement. In 2021, we assembled a rights holder-led steering committee to help further guide the finalization of the standard and its eventual launch. The instrument was subjected to rigorous legal reviews that helped to strengthen language and align it with the vision of Indigenous peoples and the thought that went into the initial design of it. The whole initiative, as you pointed out at the onset, was delayed by COVID, unfortunately, which hampered our ability to actually engage with communities in many ways, and they all had other priorities for 2 years. So, understandably, the standard is a bit delayed, but it is not too late, and we do feel that it will make a major impact once it's out there and adopted by different organizations.
Thank you so much. And indeed, it is never too late. And yeah, we're really looking forward to it being adopted. And I think some of its strength does come from that rigorous review process, that legal review, everything, the scrutiny that it underwent before it becomes adopted, so that once it's out there, it can really work effectively. Gam, I'll go back to you now. The Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact was one of 74 Indigenous organizations that endorsed the standard and signed on to it. What did you look to see in the standard to make sure it included before you felt that you could endorse it? And was there anything that you wanted to change about it?
Yeah, thank you again. First, I think I forgot to respond to one of the questions. That was, we came to be aware of this standard maybe around 2020. So just adding on that part. Right from the start, when we became aware of this standard, we saw the potentiality already because it had all those important elements already captured in part of the framing of the standards. So we were mostly looking forward in terms of how it would be consistent in terms of the different rights that we wanted to see, whether it's the cultural right, indigenous knowledge part, FPIC part, and so on. So that was more of our interest in seeing how these things cohere and is going to be effectively used. That was the main. But of course, one of on the sideline is that initially it was proposed to be called the gold standard, which we felt was not really reflecting some of the values and worldview that indigenous peoples would be looking at. So it was proposed to be changed because it can sound a bit materialistic and may not quite match with the worldviews and value systems that are looking forward. So that was, for example, one of the issue, but we did not have major issue. Thank you.
Thanks. And yes, I do remember myself when it was first going to be called the gold standard. And there are other gold standards out there. So I think it is a powerful point to remember that, you know, the very title needed to reflect the spirit of what the standard is about. And so it's nice to hear that action was taken on that. Before we go to the next question, I'll just take a moment to ask our listeners if you have any questions as we go along. We will take a few questions from the audience at the end, so you can drop them in the chat box on whatever platform you're listening, and we will collect those and pose those to the speakers at the end. So if you have any questions, please let us know. And now I will get back to you, Ella. Were there any difficult parts of the standard to come to agreement upon, and was anything left out?
Well, that's a good question. Nothing was purposely left out, but I guess the majority of the discussion between the team that put this together was ensuring that the distinct and differentiated rights of Indigenous peoples was clearly framed and well represented, so that the conventions and laws and regulations that apply to their specific circumstances are well reflected in the standard, but doing so in a way that does not that actually allows the other key stakeholder groups mentioned in the standard, notably local communities and Afro-descendant peoples, to be equally represented and taken into consideration. Things were added over time. When it was first written up, it was focused on Indigenous peoples and local communities only. But recognizing the important role that women within these communities play, we added, of course, that category and made specific reference to their needs and priorities in one of the principles. And likewise added the Afro-descendant peoples list as a key rights holder group that is of high relevance, especially in the Americas, where they're more prevalent. We also added more recently youth and ensuring that they are well represented and engaged in these processes. I guess the the process itself led to trying to find wording and ensuring that the framing was as translatable, I guess is the appropriate word, could be translated into other languages and still mean the same thing. So essentially, all of the discussions and debate resolved around making sure that the meaning and implications of the standard were clear in all languages, and everybody could see themselves as being equally and adequately represented in the principles that underpin the standard.
That's a really forward-looking process to keep in mind languages and how it's going to be translated and what words to use. I think once again that highlights the scrutiny and the level of detail that went into putting the standard together, and also calling out women, calling out youth, including Afro-descendant groups. I think that's also forward-looking. That's something that's coming more and more into discussion, but still not enough. And hopefully this standard will continue to push rights forward for those key groups. GAM, the standard is called the Land Rights Standard, and we've touched on this a bit before, but it also addresses the rights of Indigenous peoples more holistically, such as basic human rights, the rights to cultural heritage and knowledge protection, and the right to free, prior, and informed consent, which is super important. So why is there still a greater emphasis on land rights, at least in the title, and how do such rights link to the other essential demands of rights?
Yeah, that's, I think, a very important question to make people understand. And also when we're taking this forward, this standard, right? Why land is being focused here and put it at the center. One is, as I say, you cannot separate self-determination and land. So it is the basis of exercising our agency, whether it's women or other intersectional groups, or as an indigenous community, so that makes it whole. Second part is that land is also central to the indigenous worldview, where our values, principles, and way of doing things are all derived from. So the relational aspect within the community and the relational aspect between the community and the natural surrounding. And this relational aspect permeates all our systems. That is how our institutions are built, how our knowledge are developed and applied or regulated, including how our knowledge systems is used and regulated and shared and so on, right? So, and that is where land is so central to the rest of the other things that I was mentioning. So there are so many things that I could talk about this, but maybe by giving you a sense why land is so central, I hope that's sufficient for now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it touches on the point that makes the standard so unique, which is bringing that perspective and that aspect, that closeness to that land, that relational aspect where land is embedded into everything, which is a link that so many parts of the world have lost. And that's why it's so important to bring rights back, to include Indigenous peoples in active ways in decision-making processes, is because they still hold on to that perspective that doesn't always exist in communities anymore. Alain, how will it be ensured that the standard gets into the hands and in front of the eyes of lawmakers, decisions, and power holders, and anyone else who you believe really needs to adopt this standard?
Yes, another good question. It must be said that the standard was actually designed and is intended for all civil society organizations, international bodies and groups, NGOs, the private sector, and it purposely targets these actors because these are actors who can actually easily change, adopt, and integrate these standards, these principles into their due diligence requirements and processes, whereas national governments, well, that's another ball game. And so what we're hoping is that by triggering this race to the top and establishing the highest level possible standards, principles, it will promote actions that will influence governments in a positive way. So amongst the next steps that we're envisioning is that we'll be supporting active socialization of the standard itself through engagement, awareness raising, and embedding the standard in all advocacy led initiatives. There is also the fact that Indigenous peoples and community leadership is becoming globally significant and important. The guidance of Indigenous peoples, local communities is increasingly being sought at national, international levels. They are now actively being courted to engage and be part of governance committees, steering groups, and just the decision-making platforms that will actually inform anything from volunteer carbon markets to rights-based conservation and so on. And so this gives a tremendous opportunity for rights holders to lead the way and advocate for the highest possible ambition through their direct engagement in these different platforms. And it gives them a solid ground for their responding to their aspirations, and it provides them with a credible tool for moving their vision forward. And so these are some of the ways in which we're thinking of doing it, and the Rights and Resources as a global coalition will be leveraging its partners and collaborators from across the world to do the same and encourage the adoption of the standard by as many organizations as we can. And by doing that, creating a core group of progressive organizations who can then lead the way, which we hope will have a pull effect on the others so that others join up and be part of this global agenda.
Absolutely. We'll all be pushing for that. And I love your phrase, triggering a race to the top, because it is always a race to get to that actual policy change. Gam, I'll hand this over to you. What will Indigenous groups do to promote this standard and its visibility?
Well, I think one is we hoped to be part of these, whatever this alien was mentioning, at least at the global level. So we have to look at it from the different levels and maybe internally and externally, right? So linking to what Ellen was saying was at the global, regional, national, and also at the local level. That's what we will be looking forward in participating, whether it's also in the UN agencies and so on, wherever we have established some space. And therefore, strategically is to look at how do we expand that space, and also giving a very focused attention to this land rights standard to draw attention towards this is one way of looking at it. And that's definitely what we intend to do. But I think I should say something more on the internal aspect as AIPP as well as an Indigenous organization. So for example, we have been working on this for a very long time, but we are also reflecting and looking towards how we can be more effective. And when we are looking at how we can be more effective, I think this standard also comes in as a tool that we can use. For example, by next year, AIPP is hoping that we can establish this land rights platform in Asia, beyond the members of AIPP and so on. But this would be something that we'll be internally sort of promoting. And also looking at how we can internalize this in the local struggles in the different countries. Because we also need to look at this as also vision document. And for us, it is very important that when Indigenous communities have been devastated and so many things, the institutions are broken down and so on, we need to find new motivations, continue to renew our spirit, and kind of look beyond demands of rights. That is the responsibility and what do we do after we gain our rights to address this, whatever sustainability issues, knowledge, food sovereignty, all these things that this document is envisioning. So it also provides a kind of a very succinctly or coherently put one-page document that communicates this, which is quite handy, right? But just before I end, I think I should say this also is that the CBD, where the climate change, the biodiversity framework is being negotiated, is absolutely important, where they are setting all these global targets of 30-30 and then 50% and so on by 2050. In all these, there's some progress being made. All those important texts are there, the core issues, and we hope that this will also provide a further push in the final adoption of the document. I mean, just to be very brief, and I'm also looking forward to that. So it's just both campaign advocacy, visibility, and also making use of it internally by promoting it consciously, right? So it should be looked upon as a visionary document, then it is effective, and also not just as a demand for rights. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That's a really powerful way to think about this standard as a visionary document. And thank you for highlighting that it needs to be promoted internally as well. So because of time, I'm going to move now to questions from the audience. We have a few coming in. One is, how can conservation organizations adopt the land rights standard? So conservation organizations in particular. Whichever one of you would like to answer this question, you can jump right in.
Well, I can give some indication. What we're hoping is that all non-state actors directly investing or operating in landscape level interventions will adopt the standard by publicly acknowledging their commitment of their organization on their website, posting all 10 underlying principles, and their pledge to undertake dedicated ongoing efforts to enhance the frequency and effectiveness of their consultations with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendants, including women and youth, to ensure that their actions are in line with their hopes, ambitions, and aspirations, and embed the standard through their internal policies, procedures, due diligence, processes, assessments, and so forth, to ensure that they are fully embedded in the way they operate, work, and conduct their business. So this includes also ensuring that investments and donations are aligned with the standard, and that they do not actually push the organization towards more effective implementation rather than diminishing of their standards. And finally, we're hoping that all of these groups will be able to adopt and promote the standard with their peer organizations and other stakeholders, so that it can be better recognized and spread across the world more effectively.
Thank you so much. We have a question coming in for you, Gam. And this is about participatory forest management strategies that have become legal policies in some countries. And this happens, or participatory forest management has been prevalent in Asian countries, and now it's making its way toward Africa. Is this something you see as kind of embodying these rights and this standard, or can you speak to, I think this person is asking if you can just kind of speak to how the standard might apply specifically in this one case?
Well, okay, participatory forest management, the term as such, I'm not really familiar with, because there's so many things out there. But as far as my knowledge goes in Asia, we actually have not seen at the systemic level or policy level where it is working very well in Asia. So that's where I would put a question mark whether that is really effective and recommended for Africa and so on, not for other regions. I'll put a word of caution there. Now, as far as this standard is concerned, it is quite clear that it is talking about land as an inherent right. It is a human right, right? That aspect needs to be very clear because in Asia, except for one particular state in the whole of Asia that I'm aware of, not a country even though, but within the country, like in India, which is the state of Nagaland, that's the only state where this, what in India, Asia we refer to as this eminent domain or regalian doctrine in some countries, where the state have the sovereign right and can do anything that it wants. So it is only one state in the whole of Asia that I'm aware of where indigenous peoples have these rights, right, including subsurface and the forest land and so on. So this standard is, if it is applied, then this aspect needs to be addressed. That is, we are saying our pre-existing rights before the state came into its existence and before this fortress approach, for example, the conservation was applied. And that needs to be recognized as one of the rationale behind this standard. So at this standard level, I'm not sure whether a particular law exists, but they're close to it. That some of it are there, right? So we should be looking at more at those much more closely. For example, the Forest Rights Act of India. I don't have the time to explain this, but I think looking at this standard in general to be applied, there are some hope to look at the biodiversity framework that would be adopted in December. If it goes through as what we have proposed, are still retained by the negotiators. No? So I should say that this standard in general is kind of higher than what exists at the moment, excepting like India, where the Forest Rights Act is there, where it comes a bit close to it. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. So at the moment, there are too many good examples in practice out there, but the one in India that you gave, we can look to as an example for how it might be applied in other countries. Thank you so much. You mentioned the CBD COP coming up in December, but we have another question about the UN Climate Conference, which is coming before that in November in Sharm el-Sheikh. What is your message for parties participating in that conference? And is there a specific impact that you hope this standard can make at the UN Climate Change Conference this year? Perhaps, Alain, you can speak to that?
Well, what we're hoping is that the standard will set the terms and conditions of engagement with rights holders, that it will send a clear message of what expectations are and what the hopes and ambitions and vision of rights holders, namely Indigenous peoples, local communities, Afro-descendants, and women, want to see, and the types of actions and conditions that will define that. So as you know, there are lots of ongoing debates around the Article 6.4 negotiations, 6.2, but also 6.8, which is an undervalued area of engagement right now. And we see the standard as being a key instrument in guiding the types of actions that we want to see on the ground. There is a global push for more rights-based climate and conservation action, but giving I guess what the standard does is that it provides a tool or instrument that defines that in clearer terms, in crisp terms. What does that actually look like on the ground? And what do we expect organizations that will be implementing these initiatives, what we expect them to do? So just to take a case in point, there are many ongoing efforts to develop standards for the voluntary carbon markets. So how should these things be implemented, on what conditions? the current standards are all around do no harm, basically, going back to social environmental safeguards that have their utility, but do not quite meet the aspirations and goals of communities. We're hoping that the standard, the the land rights standard will define a more robust agenda and will provide a clearer means of achieving the ends that the whole world expects that these leaders will adopt going forward.
Thanks so much. And that was quite specific in parts of the Paris Agreement framework that you hope that this can be adopted into, and especially into Article 6, which does have to do with carbon markets for those who aren't familiar, and what's the term I'm searching for? Non-market approaches to achieving emissions reductions and our climate goals. So thanks for pointing out that very specific way for how this can be applied. So I know we're coming up on time here, so I will pose the same question to you both, which is perhaps a nice way to round out this conversation, bringing this whole thing back down to a human level. Someone is asking if there are any human experiences, any memories or anecdotes or stories from the creation process of this standard over the past 3 years that you might like to share that really stuck with you in working with Indigenous groups and people coming together to bring this standard to life. Perhaps, Gam, if a certain memory or story comes to your mind, you might want to start with this.
Yeah, okay. I'm not a very good storyteller, even though Indigenous peoples are expected to be good storytellers. Nevertheless, I think I would rather say that yes, it has been a good experience of these different organizations coming together and RRI facilitating this process. So it also makes communities or indigenous groups, people like us feel that, you know, it is still being supported, and that there seems to be more and more evidences also to support. It's not just about feeling, but these are also about facts, about how we should move towards. And articulating that vision in this document, I think, was really a motivating and driving force, which is a very good part of it. And I do hope that what Ellen is mentioning about climate change, I'm not following the process, but I do hope that in that kind of processes, more consensus and then even more parties are convinced, and those becomes part of the standard, in the climate change. And also in the CBD, I think these are very important steps being taken, and I do hope that immediately this is what it is in. And in the long term, of course, we still have to continue a long journey to this. And it's something like what the CBD says, you know, the living in harmony with nature. I hope that we are true to ourselves, to what we have declared, internationally speaking. But for this, I just want to end by saying that if we have to achieve of this living in harmony with nature, then we need an accompanying worldview and culture. Otherwise, we don't become part of it. We don't embody it. It will only be an intellectual exercise. So you don't really embody that vision. So it is really necessary that all of us do that. I will end with that. I hope I was okay with that. Thank you.
Of course, I think we can't be reminded enough of that complete shift in mindset and an outlook and an approach to everyday life that you are describing, and not just going through an intellectual exercise with it, but embodying and feeling that reestablished relationship with nature. I think that's a really powerful note to end on. Thank you, Gam. And then Alain, I will give you the floor once more if there are any stories or experiences or final messages you want to share about this fantastic standard.
Well, it's probably more of a personal one. I think this whole adventure has been a very humbling experience on my end. I've learned a tremendous amount. It is humbling and learning wise. principally because this whole initiative was led by rights holders and their clear vision of what they wanted in this and the specific wording and determination to ensure that their vision was clearly referenced and well represented. It gave, I guess, a whole new appreciation of the cosmovision that is embodied in this standard and the values that it aims to bring to light. And so we at RI played very much a backstopping, supporting role in coordinating and ensuring that this happened. But the leadership and thought process all come from the rights holders themselves, and they ought to be credited for developing this really robust set of principles, and the clear framing that is embedded in there is all attributable to their incredible passion, dedication, and vision. And so they should all be commended for the tremendous work that went into the design of this instrument.
Thank you so much, Ella, and hopefully that that commendment comes in the form of rights and inclusion. Gentlemen, I would like to thank you both so much for joining and so much for just sharing about the process that went into the creation of this standard. And hopefully the next conversations about this standard are going to be about how it is being implemented and how it is bringing these rights into the frameworks and into the policies as they're needed and as they must be. I'll take this moment at the end here to just let our audience know that if you want to learn more about the standard, it's going to be, again, launched officially at our event alongside COP27. You can find that event at www.globallandscapesforum.org. It's front and center on our homepage. You can click on the GLF Climate event box, and it will show you how to participate in that event, either in person if you're at the COP or online from wherever you are, and you can take part in these conversations about this new standard and many other topics as well. But I'll close out there. I would like to thank everyone for making space in your day to join us. And once again, thank you to our speakers, and wishing everyone a wonderful weekend.